Today, I'm welcoming Martina Anderson for Media News podcast. She's a member of Parliament for Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. Um, Welcome so much, Martina. Could you introduce yourselves a little bit more before we talk further?
Sorry to have to start off with a correction, but I am no longer a member of Parliament. I had been a member of Stormont Assembly. I'd been a junior minister to the late Mark McGuinness. I was an MEP in the European Parliament for 7.5 years and taken out of the European Parliament against the democratic wishes of the people in the north who voted to remain in the EU, but because the delegations from the north of Ireland came under Britain's allocation. When Brexit came along, we were taken out as well. I'm currently Sinn Féin's representative to Europe, engaging with national parliamentarians across continental Europe about the Irish unity referendum as set out in the Good Friday Agreement.
Okay, thank you.
I'm a former
Sorry for making the mistake.
That's okay. I'm a former prisoner as well. I was on my 14th year in prison when I was released on the terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
And that happened in which year? Can you refresh
Yeah, well, the Good Friday Agreement was 26 years ago, just yesterday, on the 10th of April, and I was released the following November.
After how many years in jail?
I was on my 14th year.
On your 14th year. Yeah. And we've invited you because you've given your support for the Kurdish cause and for Abdullah Öcalan. And how do you compare the Kurdish struggle for self-determination with the Irish Republican movement? What kind of commonalities do you see between the two movements?
Well, I think both the Kurdish struggle for self-determination and the Irish Republican movement share a common goal of seeking independence and sovereignty for our respective peoples, both movements, I think, have faced similar challenges, including colonization and oppression and the denial of basic human rights by the occupying powers. And just as we in Ireland fought against British rule, the Kurds are fighting against oppressive regimes. And, we had only one major power, Britain, and that was challenging enough. So I can only but imagine what it is like for the Kurdish people who have to face four in terms of Turkey and Syria and Iraq and Iran. So I think as movements, as people, we have sought, I think, to achieve objectives through, I think, a combination of now political and, diplomatic sort of diplomacy. And where democracy was denied, we've also been involved in armed resistance. So whilst I think there's always unique aspects, of every struggle, there's no two struggles the same, and you can't transport one struggle to another. But I think the overarching desire for freedom and self-determination, I think, unites us in solidarity with Abdullah Öcalan and with the Kurdish cause.
Have you known the works of Öcalan for long and been following the Kurdish issue for long?
Well, as an Irish Republican, I have been sort of advocating and an advocate for the freedom of Abdullah Öcalan because, I believe in the fundamental rights of self-determination. I suppose my first real sort of experience in relation to what was happening in Kurdistan and what was happening in the other regions, of Syria and Iraq and Iran and Turkey. Over 4 years ago, there were several MEPs when I was a member of the European Parliament, including myself, and Kurdish rights advocates. And we attempted to visit Kurdish MP at the time, Fréderike Geerdink. She was on hunger strike. I think it was 2019. It was at the beginning of that year, and she was in prison. And we were physically, literally removed from outside the prison gates by the Turkish police. And the state aggression was evident, and they didn't care about the fact that that it was being witnessed and beamed out because we were filming their naked aggression. And so we had witnessed that at first hand. And when we were there, we had also visited the headquarters of the then HDP party, and we saw the line of police in riot gear when we emerged from our meeting with them. And I stood up in the European Parliament during a session holding a poster of Fréderike Geerdink, and I was explaining what we had endured at the hands of the Turkish state, and explained that she had been detained at that stage. I think it was over a social media post and some press statements just.
Yeah, exactly. These kind of reasons are, yes, true.
Yeah. Was there an operation called Operation Olive Branch? And I think that was the reason
that was a Turkish incursion into Syria. People protested against it.
In Syria. So she had put out some social media posts about that, and I subsequently returned to the Kurdish part of Turkey to visit Fréderike Geerdink when she was released, because she was continuing with her hunger strike. And the experience of meeting Kurdish then MPs, not just like Fréderike Geerdink during her hunger strike, but also the interaction that I had when I was in Strasbourg as a member of the European Parliament. There were a number of Kurdish people who were campaigning for Abdullah Öcalan's release. And that provided, I think, a first-hand understanding of the depth of the sentiment, just and the determination within the Kurdish struggle. And these encounters, I've had quite a few in terms of interactions, but they underscored the urgency and the significance attached to issues, such as political representation, human rights, and autonomy within the Kurdish community. Only a few short months ago, I went to Diyarbakir. There was a conference there. It was called Breaking the Silence, and I met with a number of Kurdish.
So you're still able to visit the country, even though you've been some sort of trauma.
I was able to get access, and I went to the conference. And as a former political prisoner myself, and I met with other former political prisoners now 2 women struck me out of all who were there, and probably half of the conference attendees were all former prisoners. But there were 2 women. One was only recently released after serving 30 years in prison. And there was another lady, and she was the same. Both were in their 50s. So such interaction, I think, has, fostered empathy and a deeper understanding of the historical and contemporary, dimensions of the Kurdish struggle for, recognition, dignity, and self-determination.
Mm-hmm. And when you're so politically active for so long, there must be other causes too that you feel connected to in other places in the world.
Oh, absolutely. I was the chair of the Palestinian delegation, and you cannot talk about struggles and conflicts and wars going on anywhere in the world without thinking about the 33,000 people who have been butchered in Gaza, and all that has been happening over many, many years. Sinn Féin for years has called for the European Parliament to honour its own human rights obligations by suspending the Israel association agreement with the EU, because Israel has been in breach of its Article 2 obligations. I have been in Palestine on 6 different occasions. I led delegations on 5 of those occasions, and on the 6th occasion I had the honour of being an honoree by a number of Palestinian groups for the work that I had that I had been doing on their behalf in the European Parliament. So in terms of what's happening, wars, conflicts, across the world, I've been very mindful of what's been happening in other places and try to use what space that I have and when I have a place of influence, which I felt I was given and afforded to in the European Parliament, to speak up for on behalf of people who are struggling, like the Palestinians, the Kurds, and others.
Yeah, it's interesting because to talk about Palestine is also very important. And you've been a prisoner yourself, and you've met with prisoners in Kurdistan. But there's, of course, many, many, many Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails as well. And you've only yourself been released after a peace agreement was signed. And I've always believed the same thing for Turkey. Like if you talk about Abdullah Öcalan, he will only be released when a peace deal is being signed. So that's why it's so urgent to get him released, because it means you solve the issue.
Yeah.
Do you agree, or how do you look at that? Like the question of the prisoners, they need to be free as soon as possible, but you need peace to do it, or?
Yeah, well, you need the political will for actors who are involved to genuinely want to sit around the table and try to de-escalate any conflict that is taking place. And I think when you reflect back of Abdullah Öcalan, 75 years of age, and has spent over 25 years in prison. Like, he was arrested at the time when I was being released, kidnapped, I should say.
Yeah.
And put in prison. And there are thousands of Palestinian prisoners. And unless there is a political will to try to de-escalate the situation and to try to deal with the causes of the conflict and bring forward a peace and political process, then you're going to just continue on with such horrible, harrowing experiences for people all over the world. So I think without doubt, the international community needs to do much more when it comes to, for instance, for the context of this conversation, for what's happening in Kurdistan and for the release of Abdullah Öcalan. I've had a motto all of my adult life, which is long live international solidarity, and the international community should support the rights of all oppressed people, including the Kurdistan population in Turkey and the Palestinians, as well as Ukraine. Like we see and we listen to what is happening and the support that is there in the European Parliament for the aggression that has taken place in the invasion of Ukraine. And yet we don't see the same being applied to the Kurdish people, to the Palestinian people. And I think this support from the international community, it should include diplomatic pressure on Turkey, for instance, to engage, as you have said, in meaningful dialogue with Kurdish representatives and respecting Kurdish culture and political rights, and the release of political prisoners such as Abdullah Öcalan, who is now 75 years old.
Yeah. Do you think that the agreement in Northern Ireland was eventually forced by this international pressure? Because with Turkey, like, there's also this thing, it has to come from within society as well. On the other hand, international pressure is so important. How do they relate to each other?
Well, I mean, I think there's no doubt that we in Ireland recognise that if it hadn't been for the international community and for the assistance and support in terms of the negotiations that were taking place at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement might not have crossed the line and got over the line. It was the support of the international community And the international community at the moment should advocate for a peaceful and just resolution to the Kurdish issue with respect to the right to self-determination and cultural autonomy for the Kurdish people. And we have a Sinn Féin chairperson. I was just reading some of the stuff that Declan Kearney, for instance, who's the Sinn Féin's national chairperson, has said recently about, national sovereignty being inseparable from the organisation of society in the interest of all citizens, in the process of democratic change and social transformation. It should set the direction of democratic ambition on behalf of the many, not the few. And the international community, in terms of the USA and the European Union, helped during the time of the Good Friday Agreement to secure the peace process, which has still got its challenges in Ireland. But without the support of the international community, we may not have had a Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah. And in what sense? Because in the Kurdish movement, it started in the late 1970s and early 80s with wanting an independent Kurdish nation state. And in time, this has changed, and rejecting the concept of the nation state altogether. And, advocating for democratization of the whole of society. How is that in Sinn Féin? What are the thoughts within Sinn Féin about that and about reunification? How did this topic relate in Sinn Féin?
Well, obviously, look, it's a matter for the Kurdish people, for your representatives and others, to come up with a vision of what is that you would want, to bring about the changes that is needed for the Kurdish people. In terms of Ireland, we've been very clear. The right to self-determination was one in the Good Friday Agreement. It was one of the, I suppose, when we look at the leadership of Sinn Féin, whilst the Good Friday Agreement is not a Republican document, but certainly it was one of the successes in terms of one of the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement was to secure our right to self-determination. And I think when you look at, the steps that are necessary to achieve a just and lasting resolution, whilst challenges are going to emerge and they may be daunting, and even obstacles present an opportunity for growth and change. So in visualising the future of Ireland and for the Kurdish struggle for self-determination, I just see a pathway that is going to be illuminated by hope and possibility, and with a unwavering determination, I believe, and a commitment to dialogue and understanding that, both places can move forward towards a future without doubt where our aspirations are realised. The journey does require fostering empathy and embracing inclusivity and prioritising peaceful coexistence. So I think by engaging in meaningful negotiations, respect for each other's rights and identity, and promoting reconciliation and a just and a lasting resolution for both Ireland and for the Kurdish struggle, I think that they can be achieved. And I think together we can pave a pathway towards a future where diversity is celebrated and even, every individual voice is heard and respected. So for us, our right to self-determination as set out in the Good Friday Agreement, there's an obligation on the British government to hold a referendum on Irish unity, but it's also within its discretion as when it can do so. And that's the big conversation that is taking place in Ireland. But there will be a referendum in Ireland, and what Sinn Féin is working towards with others, many others. We need to plan and prepare for constitutional change in Ireland. And I believe in terms of for Kurdistan that, it is up to the Kurdish people how the struggle will be resolved. but not yourselves alone, because you need a partner for peace. Otherwise, you're at the moon. And I think that's where the international community can play a role.
Yeah. And I want to ask something a little bit more specific about your conversations with the women who'd been in prison for so long in Turkey, because so many people were arrested also in the 1990s, and they are being released now.
Yeah.
What do you learn from each other, or what have you learned from them? What have they added to your insights about the Kurdish issue?
Well, I spoke to my husband when I was at the conference. I called him and said that I felt like a short timer, even though I was 14 years in prison. When I met women who had spent 30 years in prison for some charges that were certainly would not have qualified for any political prisoner that I know to spend such long time in jail. And I think that the title of the conference was Breaking the Silence. And
Yeah.
as women, it's part of what's really not spoken about a lot. Is that, for instance, the experience that women political prisoners have with the longevity of jail can result and does result in, for instance, our inability to have children when upon release. For some, for instance, the two Kurdish women that we spoke about, their biological clocks had stopped. For myself, I had undergone a horrendous experience with a gynecologist who ended up cutting my uterus accidentally, he said. But the consequence was that I couldn't have children. And then as former prisoners, you're not allowed to foster or adopt. So there's experiences that we have, whilst they're not unique to us individually, but they serve, I think, as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice. And, for women political prisoners, that's why it was called Breaking the Silence, because they wanted to speak about some of their experiences. For instance, I can only talk about as an experience sense my own, in terms of Ella Dwyer and I, as two women who had been arrested and put in a man's jail in London. So there were 600 men in Brixton Prison and two women. And for 13 months that we were on remand, it was just daily verbal aggression and, indecent exposure and obscenities and, verbal abuse on a daily basis, directed at two women. And when I was listening there was a Palestinian former prisoner there at that conference, and they had talked about experiences, and some women had talked about rape, and where I was talking about the excessive amount of strip searching that we had. So as women, there's a bond of experience that we have that instilled in me a deep empathy for those who have been struggling under oppressive regimes. And it is a part of the former political prisoner experience in any conflict in terms of women that I don't think an awful lot has been written about, or there has been an exposure of.
It also makes clear how important intersectionality is in these kind of struggles.
Yeah. Yeah.
To see all the different positions of marginalization and how power is suppressing women more than men. And
yeah.
And you've been what was the reason that you were in touch with the Kurdish movement now specifically?
Well, as Sinn Féin's representative to Europe, I have an ongoing contact with both parliamentarians and representatives across Europe, and at times of, for instance, in Berlin, there was a launch of a graphic novel on Abdullah Öcalan, and it was in relation to his life and his political involvement and his leadership. And they had asked Sinn Féin for a representative to come and address him. So I was able to go because of the ongoing work that I have done with the Kurdish people across different areas, whether it was trying to get into jail, going to visit Leila Gervin, meeting with them in Strasbourg, and ongoing work that I have done in trying to raise issues so that people would be alert to what was happening to the Kurdish people. So I went there just last week or a few days ago and spoke to them in relation to calling for Abdullah Öcalan's release on his 75th birthday. Was very interested in the book that was done, the graphic novel, that as a way of depicting what was happening in his life, and a novel way actually of engaging with people about the story of Abdullah Öcalan. And so it's part of our international solidarity as Sinn Féin. We are progressive nationalists as well as internationalists. It's all part of what we are as Republicans.
Yeah. And for a final question, you've already said a few things about it, but looking forward, how do you envision the future of both Irish and the Kurdish struggle for self-determination? You already said international pressure, and the will to have a meaningful negotiations. Because in Turkey, for example, there have been negotiations between 2013 and 2015, but the state wasn't really into it, so to speak. So it was bound to fail. But what steps do you think are necessary now to achieve, both in Ireland and in Kurdistan, to achieve a lasting resolution?
Well, I mean, as I say, I see a path eliminated by hope and possibilities for us both. And for us in Ireland, what we are working on is the planning and preparing for constitutional change in Ireland, and what are the steps that are necessary. The British government, whilst in the one hand they have the discretion of when to call it an Irish unity referendum, on the other hand they have an obligation to do so. So there's work that the international community can do to bring the British government to ensure that it honours its commitment to the Good Friday Agreement and act with rigorous impartiality. And the Tories who are in government in Britain are certainly not acting in that way. They aren't being rigorously impartial when it comes to the north of Ireland. They want to maintain the union. And if that is by ignoring what is happening here in Ireland, because for the last at least 6, if not more, elections, the unionist position in the north of Ireland, which was supposed to always have an inbuilt majority, has been overturned. And we now are in a situation for the first time ever that Sinn Féin has the First Minister in the north of Ireland. And 103 years ago, when Ireland was partitioned, this was not supposed to happen. Yes. So and we do not want a referendum like Brexit. We want people informed. We want people to have information on the table. We want participatory democracy and processes. I think for Kurdistan, I think in Abdullah Öcalan, he's a very inspiring leader. When I have read about the work and what he has said about women in struggle and women in life and women's position in life, you can see that he reaches into and speaks to and speaks for everyone in Kurdish society. And by engaging in meaningful negotiations, respecting each other's rights and identity, and promoting, as he is doing, reconciliation and a just and lasting resolution, is absolutely achievable if the political will is there. And that's where the international community needs to pay more attention to what is happening to the Kurdish people. Like, we only had a few days ago the outcome of the elections and what happened in Fan, where the mayor, who had won by 55%, I think.
Yeah, 55 against 27, yeah.
By 27, and they tried to overturn that and tried to put someone in a position who had only gained 27% of the vote. I says, like, obviously for the Turkey establishment, democracy is an overrated concept for them.
It was already after elections in which in the smaller towns
Yeah,
soldiers were being brought in to vote for
I think
extra.
I think for the Kurdish people, they must be taking strength because the reaction from the global community to what had happened, as well as people power on the streets, forced, and the Turkish state to overturn what their undemocratic position, where they were trying to award the AKP candidate the mayoralship after receiving only 27% of the vote. And it was people power and mounting worldwide outrage, I think, that ultimately confirmed the mayor to be put in his position. Now, you then had, there was other parts where as far as I understand, the DEM party also won in, was it Hilvan? But then following the request from the AKP,
Yeah.
the government decided they hold a new election because they didn't like the outcome of that democratic election.
Yeah.
So I think that the power, people's power, is certainly something that is growing and must be given confidence to people in Kurdistan and across the different regions of what they want, what can be achieved. And I suppose, there is no doubt that the international community should be advocating for a peaceful and just resolution.
Yeah, it's also hopeful to say that now Sinn Féin has become so big and you're delivering the prime minister and it wasn't supposed to happen ever.
Yeah.
But it did happen. It cannot happen. It cannot happen until it happens, isn't it? So it's also a very hopeful picture. The most outrageous things can happen. Actually,
nothing is inevitable.
Yeah,
everything is possible.
Yes,
and I think for the Kurdish people, I think that is something to take full account of. Whilst the current administration is doing their best to suppress and oppress them, it is failing at every corner of the world that's looking at what is happening to the Kurdish people. However, there needs to be more international voices raised so that the pressure can be applied and change can be made.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No
Very
problem.
good to talk to you.
And I hope you find your two people that you once had an interaction with.
I hope so too. I'll contact you. It's interesting to talk some more maybe.
And like as I say, I always find social media is it can have its it has its challenges and its problems, particularly for women.
Yeah, but also it's amazingly wonderful. Yeah.
It's a tool of engaging and interconnection. And sure, look, there was once upon a time, unless you had in-person meetings, you never really got to understand what was happening. But the power of, I think, social media with Zooms and webinars and everything else has made the world a smaller place.
Yeah, definitely. Very good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Take
Have
care.
a nice day. We'll talk later. Okay.
Bye.